I hope you guys all enjoyed lunch. Some of you guys might have brought a little snack back in here with you, and that is perfectly okay. And I just want to, again, thank the Cajun Dome catering staff for working so hard to source locally for our lunch. And I did not realize this until the end of lunch, that someone here in our audience actually provided the lettuce. So Mr. Larry, thank you so much. He showed me a picture of the greenhouses where he's growing the lettuce, and it looks delicious. So our next session is a policy plenary with John Cotton Dean. He's the Director of Rural Prosperity Initiative for the Central Louisiana Economic Development Alliance, otherwise known as CLEDA. And I think CLEDA is a really interesting organization because it really forms a belt in Louisiana. It goes from the east state boundary to the west state boundary. And so I don't know if you guys call it a belt, but I do. The belt around a belt across Louisiana, and it really covers a really lovely wide swath of our agricultural industry within the state. And so and from one end to the other, there's all sorts of different challenges and opportunities. And so it's a really great partnership that we have working with CLEDA. They've been so instrumental in helping us develop our programs here with the Acadiana Food Alliance and developing some of our resources. And so we're just really thrilled to have John here with us today. His presentation today is on policy, the big P and the little p of policy, how food policy makes your local food economy stronger. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to John. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. It's great seeing this happening today, and just really excited to be here. I struggled, titling my presentation. I always try to do something clever, but nobody actually gets it. So, but I just did a bike race up in rural Kansas a couple weeks ago, and it was the physically most challenging thing I've ever done. And people, when they're biking next to each other, are like, "Oh man, this is type 2 fun. This is type 2 fun. Are you enjoying yourself?" And I was like, I don't even know what this means, and it's not fun. And what does type 2 fun mean? So I Googled it afterwards, and it turns out type 2 fun is something that it sucks when you're doing it. It's like climbing a mountain. It's terrible. But then when you finish and you look back, it's like, gosh, that was awesome. And that's like what you tell everybody how great it was. And that's what we can think about policy. This is something that can be a challenge when you're doing it. It can be laborious. It can take a lot of time. But it's so important, and when you look back at what you accomplished because of policy change, it's really something that deservedly gets all the glory. So again, thank you for coming here after lunch. I know it's cold. Before your mind starts thinking about timeshares and you run down the hall, bear with me. We're going to get through this together. And I really want to focus on following just an overview of policy, what it is. I want to have a good discussion afterwards about, how do we implement policy, especially in our rural communities, which is where our experience derives from, and be able to hopefully answer some questions the best I can. I will say, though, I'm not a policy expert. I have experience in policy. If you ask me about the Farm Bill, I could do my best to pretend I have the good answer, but there are people who have better answers than I do probably in this audience. So this is going to be a broad discussion, not necessarily me as an expert, because I'm no expert in this. This is a complicated topic. So as Jennifer mentioned, I represent the Central Louisiana Economic Development Alliance, or CLEDA. We cover 10 parishes in Central Louisiana. We're proud to say that every single one of those parishes is 100% rural, as defined by the USDA. It's something that we really hang our hat on, and we love working with our rural communities. We are a traditional economic development agency, which I think is important to recognize. So our main mission is to recruit businesses, major industries to Central Louisiana, and help those industries expand. So I manage our business retention and expansion program, which is the almost opposite of local food. But I think that it shows how diverse our organization is. And any organization, I think, can really impact local food if it puts the capacity towards it and it really has a strong focus, no matter what organization, what your mission is. So I'm part of the innovation and entrepreneurship team. Our team's goal is to help our rural communities prosper through creative initiatives like local food, makers in the development and helping those craftspeople sell their products. Locally, we have a strong entrepreneurship program that's led by Gary Perkins. Some of you might have worked with Allison Tomei, who's presenting next on the panel. She leads our farmers market development at a regional level. Some of you may have worked with or met Bahia Nightingale. She leads our beginning farmer training across the region. And go ahead. I focus on rural prosperity, food policy, and leadership development. So we have a really strong team. Freddie Manis, we just hired this year to lead the Alexandria Farmers Market. So while we're a traditional economic development agency, our fastest growing area at CLEDA focuses on local food. Something we're really proud of too, because you can't talk about rural economic development without talking about farmers, farmers markets, gardens. These are all critical to the economic development of our rural communities. And so I focus again on the policy, which we've been working on policy since I started with CLEDA to help spearhead the Central Louisiana Local Foods Initiative in 2013. And so you can't talk about rural economic development without talking about policy either. So when we're done talking about kind of an overview of policy, we're going to kind of dive into what I mean when I say that in Central Louisiana. But we're going to start with just an overview. I'm going to try to get through this, but I want to demonstrate, my goal is to demonstrate how policy is not just black and white with squares, it's a system. And what you do at a personal policy level affects the big policies as well. So go ahead. So when we think of policy, I think it's important for us all to recognize that we're talking about structural changes to institutions. And this, I'm going to have another definition later on, but we have to come in with a really big overview of policy. What is policy? Let's think from the top down. So go ahead. And we start with laws, statutes and ordinances, regulations, permits and licenses. These are all what we might call big Ps, often big Ps. And when I say big P, a lot of those policies are developed by elected officials, sometimes can be really intimidating to work to change. And it's something that unfortunately we focus almost entirely on often, is these big Ps. And we get really caught up in the big Ps, which I don't even consider type 2 fun. I think that's really difficult fun. I want to also recognize that it's not just about the regulations. It's not just about the ordinance when we talk about food policy. We cannot forget about resolutions, executive orders, others what we might call statements of intention or direction. So there are communities like, for example, the community of Jonesville that we worked with in Central Louisiana. They passed a local food municipal resolution. And that's not saying that they're going to make sure that every citizen in the town of Jonesville has access to local food, or that every citywide meeting there's a requirement to have 10% locally sourced produce. That's not what a resolution is. We support the development of local food. We're not going to get in the way of local food development in Jonesville. And for us, that's a really good starting point. So we really need to keep that in mind too when you start thinking about policies, that it's not black and white. Policies can be complicated, and they can be really big, and they can be really small, but there's a process to make them happen. So this is what people think of policy, right? Black and white, squares, statutes, regulations, ordinances. My background in city planning, and I love talking about city ordinances, but unfortunately nobody else does, and I think it's okay. But this is really what it looks like when you start out, and we don't think of it as a system. We don't think of necessarily how one policy affects the other policy, or how a federal policy might affect a local policy. And that's something that's really important to recognize from the very beginning. And so I want to just give a quick example to showcase really how federal policy might affect us at the local level and what we might be able to do about that. And unfortunately, I chose farm to school, which is a very difficult nut to crack. And I'm sure many of you working in local food, maybe when you started out, you thought, well, I'm going to start a farmer's market, I'm going to get a community garden going, and I'm going to get local food in my local school. And that's usually how it happens. When we started the Local Foods Initiative, we had a farm-to-school network. We were really into it. We thought it was going to be some low-hanging fruit. We quickly realized that what we do at a local level from a policy perspective is important. But, man, you got to think about the Farm Bill when you're thinking about farm-to-school. You have to think about what's happening with the United States Department of Agriculture and the regulations that are developed in Washington, D.C., and how that affects the state regulations with farm-to-school and local food purchasing. And I want to make that clear. When I say farm-to-school, I'm talking about local food purchasing and not necessarily growing at the school. And how that affects the community, the local government, for example, the school district, how those contracts are developed and how those contracts have to oftentimes be to the standard of a state regulation or even sometimes a federal regulation. And then when you go down to the school level and when you approach your school and you might approach your principal, that principal might say, hey, I got to check with the school district. And the school district says, well, I have to check with, the state, and I have to check with the federal, let me call up the federal government, right? But that's not going to happen. But you get the point. I mean, it's you have to work your way up. The local policies are directly affected by federal policies. This is a challenge, and you can't just waltz into your local school and expect to change that policy. But again, I don't want us to think of policy as so linear, and that's a big challenge. When we think about food and food systems, we have to think about it from a systemic perspective, how one action affects all the other actions. That's the only way that a food system is going to change. And so policy is no different. What you do at a local level and your own policies have a profound effect on federal policy. And I know it can be complicated, but there's a system and there are steps and there's a process. So think about what your own personal policy might be. It might be, let's spend $5 a week on local food. For example, in Central Louisiana, we always state that if every single household spent just $5 on local food, our farmers would retain over $91 million annually. That's what we want every household's policy to be. If every household's policy was to spend $5 on locally grown food, you would see profound policy changes that not just at the household level, but at the neighborhood level. You would see it potentially, if you're talking about farm to school, you get that policy change in those personal policies within the PTA. And to us, the PTA, in our experience, a PTA can be the bread and butter of food policy change at a local school. So you're thinking, all right, let's go local, let's go a little bit bigger, let's go a little bit bigger than the PTA, and then let's go a little bit bigger and see what we can do at that institutional level. And again, then you start talking about, okay, these are the big P's. We start thinking about changes at institutions, and that's where it gets complicated. But those little changes and those little policies that work their way up to the big P's is really how you, at a personal level, and when you start thinking about a system, and how you can make those approach those changes. So I wanted to. This again is what you think of a policy, but I want you to think about policy, one more click please, of not just federal, state, and local, but organizationally and you at a personal level too, and how your personal policies can affect organizational policies and how those organizational policies can begin to affect the local policies at maybe a parish level, a city level, and on up. So this is another big definition for food policy, but I like this definition because it focuses on the system. But if there's one takeaway from this definition, I want you to focus on that final sentence. Food policy operates at the global, national, state, regional, local, institutional, and personal levels. So again, we can't think of policy as just at the Farm Bill level. We have to think of policy at our local level and our personal level before we begin taking those baby steps to impact national policy eventually. So now we're going to start talking about how do we implement policies. I know that was a pretty quick overview. We just got out of lunch, but I'm happy to discuss it further afterwards. But this is where I think it's really fun. So food policy development in Central Louisiana is really dependent, I think, on kind of three areas. So we rely on local food leadership. We rely on the people of Central Louisiana to have the skills, resources, and connections they need to be local food leaders at a policy level in their own communities, whether that's a policy leader in their neighborhood, or that's a policy leader for their school, or in their municipality, or at the state. We put a lot of energy and a lot of effort on developing local food leaders to affect policy change beyond, just even their household, but how can they be leaders? We have a program called Louisiana Food Fellows. There's a few food fellows in this room with us, and as you all know, we bring in national experts who focus on policy to Alexandria to share the resources, to share the connections, and with every cohort, and they come out of it and they help lead policy changes not only in Central Louisiana but really across the state. And we can't talk about policy changes without having those individuals who have the resources and the connections to be able to make that happen. So I mentioned little p, and I want to make it clear that when we talk about big P, we're talking about big policies that are changed by elected officials. We're talking about the Farm Bill, for example, state policies. When we're talking about little p, we're talking about those policies that might change the practices of organizations. We might be talking about a healthy vending machine policy at a work site. We might be talking about a preschool deciding to purchase 10% of their food locally. That's a little p policy. That's where we see as individuals and in rural communities, we can make a big difference from a policy perspective. And that's why a lot of our work starts with a little p. That doesn't mean we don't work towards larger policies, but that's where a lot of our energy is focused because it's not intimidating, it's accessible, and again, it's those little victories you can make towards big P. But that doesn't mean that we forsake federal policy changes. So one thing that we do, and we put a lot of emphasis in Alexandria and Central Louisiana, is partnering with our national organizations that focus on federal policy. Because if federal policy is going to change, they have to hear from the people on the ground. For example, we partner with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC. It's a wonderful organization based on Capitol Hill. And I was just out there in March. They flew me out. I met with both our senators as well as Representative Abraham to talk about the Farm Bill and making sure that they saw a face to the work that the Farm Bill funds in Central Louisiana. And so being able to do that in Washington, D.C. is invaluable. We have another farmer from Vernon Parish doing the same thing in a couple of weeks in DC. So going to Capitol Hill, meeting in their offices, meeting with their staff, especially now when the Farm Bill is in the Appropriations Committee being debated and discussed even further. So again, you can affect federal policy change, but you have to be willing to partner with those organizations and those experts because we're not federal policy experts, but our partners are. So and I kind of jumped a little bit, but one thing we do in Central Louisiana, one of the first really action items that was spearheaded when we developed the Central Louisiana Local Foods Initiative was start what we call a food policy council. To us, and to me personally, I think food policy councils are the best vehicle for implementing food policy at a local, regional, and state level. You'll see food policy councils across the country that are starting up. I'll show a few slides and a few numbers for food policy council networks across the country. But you could think of food policy councils as really big old tables where you have diverse stakeholders or perspectives or viewpoints coming to the same table to talk about policy. So it's like a bunch of people who love type 2 fun getting together a couple of times a month or a couple of times, once every few months to talk about, what's in the food system that needs to be changed, what are the policies that can be developed to break down those barriers. And so for us, we have emphasized Food Policy Council development, and that's one of the reasons we developed the Louisiana Food Fellows program, is because we needed a strong Food Policy Council in central Louisiana. And I know that there's a very strong Food Policy Council in New Orleans doing a lot of wonderful work that's nationally recognized. And I think it's important for us all to recognize, too, that a Food Policy Council does not need to be a governmental organization. And sometimes it's a benefit if it's not a governmental organization. And we're not, CLEAT is a 501c3, we're not a governmental organization, and we convene the Food Policy Council. And I'll share a little bit more about what we're able to do as a Food Policy Council in a bit. So again, this is a linear path for food policy councils. You know, let's talk about assessing the food system. Let's talk about connecting stakeholders. In the end, every food policy council's goal is to recommend food policy change. That's what differentiates a food policy council than a local food coalition, is that your goal in the end is to recommend and help facilitate the implementation of policy changes at whatever level you are charged with. And everything else in that list right there, that never ends. We all know that. You're never done assessing the food system. You're never done connecting stakeholders in different perspectives. And it's important that you recognize in a food policy council that the goal is to have people who have different perspectives, not just producers, not just health advocates, not just policy wonks. You need everybody in the same room. And that's really what makes a successful food policy council function and sustain. And what's really wonderful about food policy councils is that they're all over the country. So there's currently almost 240 food policy councils across the country. That's, again, at the state level, the regional level, the local level, some governmental agencies, others that are local, sometimes 501c3s, other times just kind of ragtag bands of people. But they all work. And many of them are successful. And one of those reasons is that if you form a food policy council, you're entered into a network, and people are excited to share policy information. They're excited to share resources. The Center for Livable Future, for example, has an incredible library out of Baltimore that's just chock full of food policy council stuff, which is, if you're in the food policy council world, it's really exciting. And so I urge you to check out the Center for Livable Future, and I think it's called the Community Food Networks, or Food Policy Council Networks, I'm sorry. But they have they have incredible information about food policy councils. And this is a list, this graph shows the amount of food policy councils per state. On the far left, you have California, North Carolina, Michigan, Kansas, Ohio. Outside of, there's a lot of states you'd expect, others you may not. But on the far right, under that arrow, that's Louisiana. So we have under 5 food policy councils in the whole state. We have more than a couple of states, but not much. And what I bring this up because when we start talking about state food policy, you can't have a strong state food policy network without a series, I think, of food policy councils across a state. And so, if there's only a few food policy councils in the state, that makes it difficult for a state, at a state level, to think about food policy. And so I just can't stress enough the importance of really thinking about it at a regional level. What are we doing to affect policy, and how are we organizing ourselves to be able to do that? And I just want to end with a quick example of what our Food Policy Council is doing. So we've had a few accomplishments in the past 6.5 years. A lot of those accomplishments are getting people to show up to meetings. But we are proud to say we've done a few things, including working with Town of Jonesville to help them pass a municipal food resolution, developing workplace guidelines for work sites who can adopt those guidelines to implement Little Ps in their work sites. But something we're doing now, and this goes back to how we're organized. So we, because we're not tied to a government, we are charged with facilitating the implementation of policies through our partners. This is not something we can't just go in and implement policies. I don't know if Max would want me to go say, hey man, you need to implement this food safety policy tomorrow. But we can work with you to be able to do that. And so we are charged with the challenge of how do we message the importance of food policy at a local or regional level. Who are the partners? Who can we target to implement policies? And so we've developed a food policy toolkit. It's under construction now. We should be able to publish it in August or September, but it will be an online and print resource with the goal of presenting it to police juries, presenting it to municipalities, and other regional entities, but also with work sites and community organizations to say, hey, this is what food policy is able to accomplish. This is what food policy is. It's accessible. It's something that you should do, and we're happy to work with you to make it happen. And so, I think the biggest takeaway from this presentation, I think, should be that food policy is accessible. It's not something that you need to think about just as a farm bill challenge. And I kind of glossed over some examples, but North Carolina food policy councils are banding together to change zoning ordinances in different communities. In Los Angeles, the city and the school district work with the food policy council there to implement good food purchasing programs that are requiring the school district and the city to purchase at least a certain percentage of food that's locally sourced in Southern California. In Central Louisiana, we're working with our work sites to implement work site guidelines that requires them to purchase, locally sourced meals at their meetings, as an example. So food policy councils across the country are making policy happen and work for them. And so I urge everyone in this room to consider looking around your community, looking in your region, and thinking, is there an opportunity for a food policy council to develop, because that makes food policy that much more accessible and makes it easier to implement and be sustained. So I wanted to just share very quickly pictures of 3/4 of our team members. But if you have any questions about what we do in Central Louisiana, happy to answer them now or later. Allison is in the middle of the room there too. But thank you all for the time, and I think we have time for questions or whatever. Just not about the farm bill, please.
So when we start talking about food policy, is there any connection to packaging when we start talking about policy? Because, one of the big things we deal with is single-use litter ending up in the bayou, and that's all food.
Right.
So that packaging, what's the connection between the policy and dealing with the end product of the packaging and the litter?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think something that we're not necessarily doing in Central Louisiana, and regrettably so, because often we're just trying to get something going. But in a lot of places in the country, Nashville is one of them, for example, if you want to look at a big city, that are implementing waste policies for local food. I know there was a great panel earlier about waste, but I know there's policies that are being implemented at the municipal levels throughout the country that address food waste. And that's kind of a new frontier for a lot of food policy councils as well. So I urge everyone who's interested in that topic to I hate to just say Google it, but unless you're a millennial. But those examples do exist, and I would urge you, Nashville is one of those leaders that's gotten some good national attention. I don't know how it's going or if it's even still going when they changed mayor since then, but that's out there. That's a really good question, and kind of a new frontier as well.
So I take it we don't have a food policy council here in Lafayette, right? In Acadiana?
That's a question for you all.
There's a statewide food policy committee that was born out of meetings at the Southern SOG conferences in January, and it's headed up by Elise Munoz out of New Orleans. It's kind of an offshoot of the New Orleans food policy group.
Okay. But to your point, we need a bunch of these around the state.
Yeah, I will say that the states that, that list, that graph I showed earlier when you saw a list of California, Michigan, North Carolina, those states are where you see a lot of the statewide initiatives and policies that are helping local food producers the most. You're seeing a lot of gap funding going into those states, for example,
Right.
that are driven by food policy networks, both from the ground, really from the ground up. And so there's tremendous evidence showing that the amount of food policy councils and the impact that food policy councils have at a local level really affecting or impacting those states at the state level. And so I would strongly urge us to consider that when thinking about food policy councils at a regional level. And that's why I love coming outside of our region and talking about food policy councils, because I think it's so important for us to consider where we stand as a state and how we can really unite and network at a policy, around policy.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, to give you all a heads up, we work on policy every day at the Kitty and the Food Hub. So if anybody wants to come sit down, talk, discuss, help create a coalition, we'd be more than happy to do that with y'all. This is something we constantly work on.
Anybody else? All right, I think that's it for this session.
Great.
We're going to have a short break before the next session, then meet back.
Yep, we're,
Thank you.
sorry.